At age 14, I moved with my family into a new house. At first glance, you would never think it was haunted. It was a beautiful, warm family home, but with a creepy history. We experienced all sorts of things in that house, especially my mom, sister, dad. But I will tell you my only one experience, because otherwise this would be a very long post. First, cold rooms, always. How cold it was in some rooms. My mom's and my dad's room used to be so cold that my parents slept in the living room, opening and closing doors, knocking on front doors and no one in front of them has become normal for us. Once the pan from the stove flew by itself through the whole kitchen and hit the other end of the wall. It was almost 2 meters away from the stove. At night, we would hear footsteps. The scariest thing I've ever experienced. I saw a little girl from our window running through our yard. She just disappeared. And I will never forget her dress she wore. The white dress the girls wore around the 20s. When we told these strange experiences to a neighbor, an old woman, she said that around 1920 to 1930, a family lived there. A mother killed her children and then herself. The husband, father of the child, mistreated both the wife and the children, so they killed themselves. That is why the house is full of hatred, cold, strange, and uncomfortable feeling of constant fear and discomfort. Today that house was demolished. My parents built a smaller house for themselves, and they haven't had any experiences for 10 years. It all seemed to be related to the house, even though today I always pray for the children and the mother. Hey guys, I don't talk about this experience much, but I came across this subreddit and I knew I needed to tell my story. I had a few things happen in the duplex apartment I lived in with my sister and my mom, and occasionally my mom's ex-husband. And when they were off and on when I was little, the first thing that happened one night, I was asleep in bed, but having an awful dream. The sky was dark, blood red, and there was a lot of lawnmowers sitting around covered in blood as well. It scared me enough that I woke up, and after a few minutes of trying to decide if I should go in with my mom and sleep, I decided to try to close my eyes again. Before I could close my eyes, I saw 2 figures float out of my wall. One of them was a little girl with a Victorian maybe style dress and curly blonde hair. The other was a black mass that I could tell was a man, but it had no face. I had a very intense feeling that the little girl did not want to be with the man. I could feel a fear from her almost. As quickly as they appeared, they turned and walked back into the wall. I ended up dragging my sister with me into my mom's room. When she revealed she'd seen something too, but didn't know what it was. We slept with my mom that night. The second experience in that duplex, my sister and I were sitting on the stairs. Right around the corner of the stairs was a little attic type thing that would always find objects that had gone missing, keys, silverware, etc. Well, while we were sitting, my sister was a step above me, sitting facing me, and we were talking. Suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder, and it gave me such a hard shove that I tumbled down the stairs and ended up with both of my eyes being blackened. After the stairs incident, my mom was frightened enough to move out of the duplex. However, I've always felt sensitive to things ever since. I always feel like I see things, and I have my back turned in bed. I feel extremely uneasy and scared, and have to face outward towards the open door. I've always wondered if something could be the cause of my severe anxiety and depression that developed during my childhood. Edit. I recently had to move my mirror to the other side of the room due to getting a very uneasy and anxious feeling with it pointing anywhere near my bed. Disclaimer: I have never actually seen a ghost, but I have interacted with them. When I was a kid, I would visit my mom every winter and summer for a few weeks. Joy of divorced parents. It was a lovely 2-floor house, with the bottom floor being half underneath the ground, kind of like a basement, but the house was built on a hill, so it's basically another floor. It had wood floors, and a big creepy staircase that led from the main entryway down into the bottom floor of the house. During the day, things were quiet, and nothing was really weird, except I'd get an uneasy feeling in the hallway of the downstairs. As a result, I just wouldn't go there. When nighttime would come around, you could hear footsteps walking up the stairs and through the upstairs hallway where the bedrooms are. The only ones in the house would be myself, my mom, my stepdad, and my older sister. I memorized each of their step patterns, and the footsteps I would hear never matched any of them. The bedroom were also all next to each other, so I would have been able to hear their doors open, and then them leaving the room if they decided to get up. However, almost every night, the footsteps would originate from the downstairs hallway and walk up the staircase and into the bedroom hallway. Sometimes it seemed to just stop there, and sometimes I could hear them go back downstairs and back to that hallway. I was never brave enough to investigate, but that experience has stayed with me for my entire life. My family moved into a nice, fairly new little subdivision when I was about 6 years old. There was a little patch of woods in the backyard, probably about half a football field deep, that separated our house from the house behind us. I remember there being a fallen down tree that my twin sister and I would jump around. It was still rooted in the ground, just bent over, so it was bouncy when we jumped or walked on it. A few weeks after moving there, I was in the woods jumping around on the tree by myself when a little girl walked up to me and asked to play. She wore a pink dress, had a teddy bear, her hair in pigtail braids. I thought she lived at the house behind us, so we started to play almost every day, but only when my twin sister wasn't outside with me. I remember my parents just laughing at me when I talk about her, and having a little whispered conversations with other family and neighborhoods about my new friend. At the time, I never thought much of it, but now I know that they thought she was just an imaginary friend. I mean, my twin sister had never seen or played with her, and neither did my little sister, who was 3 at the time. She wouldn't come around if they were out there with me. She always hid from my parents if they came outside while we were playing. One day when we were playing, it was about to storm, so I told her we needed to get home. She told me she didn't have a home, and I immediately invited her to stay with me. I asked my mom, and thinking she was imaginary, my mom said yes. She spent the night with me that night, and the next morning got up and went to school. I never saw her again after that. Years later, I was writing a creative nonfiction story for my creative writing class. I decided to write about my imaginary friend, and I asked my parents what I used to do with her and what they remember. That's when my mom told me that apparently the day when I went to school, after she spent the night, my mom was home cleaning the house. The electric toys in our playroom kept going off, making noises or winding up and walking on their own. It started to freak her out after going to turn them off a few times. And eventually she brought the entire toy box downstairs and put it on the couch to go through and figure out which ones were going off. She says that she thought they needed new batteries or that we hadn't turned them off all the way or something. My mom has always been kind of sensitive and seen spirits before, but only in a few instances. So she didn't really think ghost when it came to the girl because she never saw her. But the toy still freaked her out since she knew that I let her spend the night before. Anyways, she started vacuuming the living room, and as she walked past the stairs, she saw a little girl with a pink dress, teddy bear, in pigtail braids staring at the top of them. She screamed and the little girl vanished. And that's the day I stopped seeing her. I ended up doing research after that. Even got a hold of the landlord for that house while writing my essay. And I never found anything about a girl dying in that area, or previous owners losing a child, or anything like that. Before the neighborhood was built, it was just a forest. There was a gas explosion in the town in 1957, which killed I think 12 people, but I haven't been able to find the ages or pictures, just names. And I don't remember hers, so I can't draw her to that definitely. So I'm not sure what her history is, or why she was there. Just a couple of weeks ago though, I was over at the next door neighbor's house. Our parents are still friends, and their son is a year younger than me, with my youngest sister tutoring their son. My little sister is only 5, and I let her go outside and play while I tutored. When it was time to leave, I went outside to get her, and I saw her in the backyard of the house we lived at, jumping on the fallen tree, giggling and talking to herself. I told her we needed to leave, and she ran to me, turned around and waved goodbye. I asked her about it, and she just said it was just her new friend. So the question still remains, was she an imaginary friend or a ghost? My mom swears she saw her, and I remember seeing her as a kid too. But at the same time, my mom could have just freaked herself out and remembered my description of her, and her mind played a trick on her. But if that were the case, how would my little sister make a new friend that no one else could see, playing on the same tree I used to play on with her? I have heard plenty of stories of people who have predicted their death. Now it's my turn to share some death predictions I have heard that came true. I worked as a lead social worker in a nursing home. Now there's nothing inherently scary about working in a nursing home, or just nursing homes in general, other than the occasional horrendous smell that will knock your socks off. But in the time I have been working as a head social worker at my nursing facility, I have had 2 residents predict their own death. One of them isn't terribly creepy, mainly just sad. The other one gives me the creeps. We will start with the not terribly creepy one. This particular resident had been here for a bit, and were there for a long-term care. They were fairly young, below the age of 60. They were there because their medical issues made it difficult for them to live independently. I started being their social worker around the COVID-19 pandemic, and at the time of this incident, it was around December 2020, getting close to Christmas. The resident was in fairly stable condition, no major health problems that were going on to cause imminent death. By all means, they would live a lot longer had it not been the circumstances around their death. But I will not provide detailed information on what happened. One day I was chatting with the resident when they asked if they could go home to visit their family for the holidays. With the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, it was policy that the residents could not go on outings for the potentially they would come back and cause an outbreak. So, I sadly told the resident no, they could not go home for the holidays. The resident began to sob, and I did my best to comfort them. I enlisted the help of the director of nursing to try to settle them. As we were talking to the sobbing resident, the resident confided that they were utterly sure they would not live to see the next Christmas. We did our best to reassure the resident that they were in stable condition, and there was nothing wrong that would cause them to die within the next year. But unfortunately, due to a lot of sudden and conflicting factors, the resident passed away 2 weeks later. Now the second story. This resident was probably somewhere in their 60s. Resident had numerous health issues, but since we were providing nursing care and rehabilitation, it was assumed that they would get to go home with their spouse. One day while chatting with a nurse on the residence hall, I heard the resident cry out. I walked over to the room, and they were in a fetal position on their bed, with the utter look of terror and dread on their face. I immediately asked what was wrong, if I needed to fetch their nurse. Resident looked at me and said they were people just outside the door talking about how the resident was going to die soon, and how they were going to dig the resident's grave. I attempted to reassure the resident, that no one was talking about the resident dying. There was no one there talking about digging the resident's grave. I'd just been fairly close to their room, and the conversation between the nurse and I had nothing to do with the resident, let alone anyone dying and digging their grave. The resident seemed to calm down a bit, and things proceeded as normal. But just days later, the resident was transferred to the hospital, where they died shortly after. It still haunts me. What entities were outside the resident's door, discussing the resident's death days before it occurred?